All right, welcome back. This is the Something Venture Podcast. I am Kent Lindstrom. I am your host. My guest today in a minute here is going to be Charles Hudson. Two things to tell you before we start. Number one, on a lighter note, the joke I try to make in this episode, you'll hear it, and botch, in describing the difference between my podcast and Harry Stebbings' podcast. And if you haven't listened to Harry Stebbings' podcast, you probably should. You might enjoy it. It's called the 20-Minute VC. The joke I'm trying to make is that Harry has a very Willy Wonka view of the world from the Charlie and the Chocolate Factory movie, which is a very positive, everything is beautiful, and venture capital is like working in a candy factory. Whereas I have a Mad Max view of venture capital in which world is a much more difficult and violent game, although there are still winners and losers. So that was the joke I was trying to land. It's not even that funny a joke now that I say it to you. The second thing on a more serious note is Charles says something I want to point out later in the podcast. I ask him a question about what it's like being a black guy in venture capital, and he says something very generously to the effect of, "You were worried about asking that, weren't you? And I'm glad you did." Now, if you're wondering why he would say that, what it was he saw in my face, or why he would say something like, "You were worried about asking that question," let me pull you, my listener, along with me, and you can make your own decision about how you would handle it. As I talk to people of color, women, people who are LGBTQ, etc., sometimes I've had them on the podcast because I'm curious about that part of their life, among many other things about them. So the question that you get, or the thought that I get sometimes, I'm talking to somebody who's, say, a black venture capitalist, and not, by the way, not the first one I've had on the podcast. You think to yourself, maybe if this was a white guy, I wouldn't ask him questions like that. I would just get right into it. Harry Stebbings style, I ask all the questions about, what it's like to be a VC and what's hot and what's not, all that kind of thing. But in my mind, what I want to know, and what I think a lot of my listeners tell me they want to know, is what's it like to be a black VC in Silicon Valley? On the other hand, if you are that guy, do you really want to be asked that question every damn time you're on a podcast, or you just want to talk about what you do professionally? So that's the conundrum I have from time to time. And that's what Charles is talking about when you hear that in this podcast. And it was very generous with him. And he's a great guy, and I thank him for that. I thank him for being on this podcast, and I hope you enjoy it. This is my Something Venture Podcast episode with venture capitalist Charles Hudson. All right, welcome back. This is the Something Venture Podcast. I'm Kent Lindstrom. I am your host. My guest today is Charles Hudson. How you doing?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for doing this. So Charles is the founder, GP of Precursor Capital. He was formerly with Uncork, which I'm just getting to say Uncork instead of Softec. It used to be Softec. Went to Stanford twice, came there by way of Michigan, worked at Q-Tel, and is now a venture capitalist in Silicon Valley. Did I get that right?
Precursor Ventures is the only thing I would change instead of Precursor Capital. That's all.
Oh, man.
That's all right.
I feel like I should have gotten that right. So I had this great bit I was going to start with, and how another guy who went to Stanford and became a venture capitalist. Thank you very much. This has been the Something Venture Podcast. It's not that exciting. But I found something out that I got to talk about first. Then we'll get it. Damon Wayans is on your website. Why is Damon Wayans on your website? This is the most exciting thing that's happened to me today.
We are an investor. Damon Wayans and Christopher Jones have a company called Special Guest. Mm-hmm. And we are investors in their company and proud to support them. And it's funny you mentioned that. I have an LP in my fund who every time he comes to town, he always asks me, "Is there any chance that Damon's going to be in the office today?"
What do we've met some people, like Joe Montana has a fund. What do you, like, it used to be kind of maybe not too serious, but then I think people started looking at Ashton Kutcher and they're like, did he make like 20 million on his acting career and then 80 million on his investing career? Like, what is that thing of people sort of Joe Montana and MC Hammer and all basketball players now too, kind of coming into this world?
I think a big part of venture is access.
Yeah.
And can you get access to really interesting opportunities? And I think there's a couple of ways to do that. One is to have a really established long track record of being a good investor. Another is being a person that people want to be around.
Yeah.
And I think celebrities and athletes are people that other people want to be around. And I think there's this sort of meme that, oh, because you're an actor, you can only be good at acting, or because you're an athlete, you can only be good at playing sports. Most of the athletes and entertainers I've met have a really wide variety of interests and also a really wide variety of skills. So it's not just because they're great at acting that they can't be good at something else.
That's interesting. I met the guy who's the guy on the ground for the Joe Montana Fund. And you realize this guy is very good as a young, venture capitalist. Outstanding, et cetera. But you realize that probably when an LP meets him, he goes, well, you're like all these other great guys, but I get to have a steak dinner with Joe Montana.
That's right.
when I put money with you. Not that you're just a schmuck with Joe Montana. You're a talented guy with Joe Montana. And it's a kind of fascinating area.
And it works. I think in the case of Damon's company, it's really focused on meeting the needs of creative entertainers. And so I can't think of anybody better to start that business than someone who's in the business.
So interesting. Well, normally I find on these podcasts, like talking to people about their career in venture capital is not very interesting. But you've taken a pretty interesting path. So I would say Stanford to being a venture capitalist is not that weird. How'd you come to Stanford, though? Were you like...
It's really random. Yeah. So I'm from right outside of Detroit, Michigan. I'd been to California one time before. My cousin was in the Marines.
Yeah.
And so I went to his graduation in the Marines, from the Marines down in San Diego. It's the only time I'd been to California. Stanford was the last school I visited. And I was like, there's no way I'm going to move all the way from Michigan to the West Coast. I have at the time I had one family member who lived in Oakland. And I'm like, this is a big move. And I think like a lot of people, I landed at SFO and drove down Palm Drive and got out of the car and said, this is pretty awesome. The weather here, after, like many people, I came in with shorts, T-shirts, and flip-flops and quickly realized that Northern California is not Los Angeles.
It's not San Diego.
It's definitely not San Diego. And I really just took to Stanford, and I ended up making my school decision as an undergrad based on where did I feel like the students at the school were the happiest.
Oh, interesting.
And that was basically Princeton and Stanford were the two campuses that I visited where I thought the students here seem really, really happy here and seem to be really enjoying the experience of being on campus.
That's funny. I went to Northwestern. It was pretty fun. Like people went to Harvard seemed kind of miserable. MIT, certainly, they seemed kind of miserable. Northwestern was a blast.
My sister went there for undergrad and graduate.
Yeah, it was so cool. So I normally don't talk about, so you come into, you end up working for in Q-Tel. This is a thing, right? This is a government thing.
They're still around. Mm-hmm.
Isn't that that seems like the man of venture capital for us? Seems like I don't know. Are they doing bad things? I guess a lot of tech companies are doing bad things.
It's interesting. When I joined Q-Tel, I had all of these preconceived notions that, as a venture fund, we're going to end up investing in all of these like spy gadgets and whiz-bang tech. It wasn't that at all. If you think about the CIA's job, it's to be this global data vacuum, get all of this information, process it, tag it, and make sure that it gets to the right people so that they can make important decisions about information and national security. They're a big data processing engine.
Yeah.
And so most of the problems they have or challenges they have are the ones that industry has. They just have 10 to 100x the volume.
Right.
And so there's a lot of areas when I was at Q-Tel where I was like, wow, the agency was on the cutting edge of things like, we didn't have a terminology for big data. We called it, high data volume processing. But there were all of these problems that the CIA had a decade ago that are now commercial.
Interesting.
And the thing I really learned is that for any customer, whether you're the CIA or whoever it is, sometimes you're on the cutting edge of these problems. And if you can engage with the people who are trying to build products that solve these problems and you can be an early customer, you can actually have influence in the direction of the technology.
Right.
And so it was a really fascinating, I think also at the time, this is, circa 1999, this is pre-Palantir. I think there was just a lot of skepticism in the Valley that the government could be a good customer for a startup, government at any level, state, local, or federal. And I really learned that the people at the CIA are really talented, they're really smart, and they have a difficult operating environment because it's the federal government, but it's not so difficult that you can't break through.
Yeah, that's Michael Lewis's point. Is he's got a new book about the federal government where he talked to all these agencies, and his conclusion was that the federal government below the top political level is a bunch of really, really competent, smart, dedicated people, like in the Weather Service and in the CIA and all these services, who are just trying to do their job very well and do their job very well. And they're like amazingly competent.
Yeah, it really did. It really did sort of change my perspective on like government service. And I walked away with actually quite impressed by the quality and caliber of people I met.
Yeah. And so how did you end up at then Softtech at the time Softtech, now Uncork?
So I had known Jeff. Ironically, when I was at Q-Tel, Jeff was at Reuters Greenhouse, which was the corporate venture group for Reuters. And if you think about, well, what does Reuters do? Reuters vacuums up all of this financial information from around the world, tags it, and tries to make sure that it's accessible and usable. So it ends up that Jeff was looking at a lot of the same kinds of companies that we were looking at Q-Tel, just for different purposes. And I remember this was a really different time. When Jeff was first doing Softtech Uncork, he was a super angel before we even had that term.
Yeah.
And there was like Jeff, Iden at Felicis, Mike Maples, a really small set of people who were aggressively investing in these early stage startups. And so then he started investing in a bunch of people that I knew,
right, and
backing their companies like Elad and Othman and Jason Shellen and a bunch of people that I'd known either through school or through work. And he just kept coming up. And then ironically, I was thinking about coming back into venture. And so I went and sat down with Jeff in 2009 and said, hey, I'm thinking about maybe getting back into early stage venture. And we started looking at deals together and then decided to work together.
I have a question about that period. So you mentioned this. There is this period where there's like a few institutional seed investors, but not a ton of them. Mm-hmm. I was thinking about this the other day. Why from that? So all these guys have become incredibly wealthy and done incredibly well, been great companies. But it seems like for there being this period where there were just a few of these guys, there doesn't seem to be one of them that was in like, and I think this might go to how tough seed investing can be. None of them were in like five great, like, oh, I was in Pinterest and Uber and Slack or whatever companies were around at the time. They were in like one or two, but now there's many more funds. Like, why wasn't there a guy who's just like I was in all of them. Like all the big hits.
Ron was in a lot of them.
Yeah, I guess
Conway.
That's right. I guess Ron Conway wasn't. Chris
Sacca was in, Uber and Twitter, among others. He's got other great ones. Mike Maples and Ann are in Lyft and a handful of. I think the thing that's different, and I didn't appreciate this until now, back when I first joined Softtech, we collaborated with, I think we had at one point 40% of our portfolio companies in common with Felicis.
Interesting.
It was some crazy high, maybe I'm off, but it was a disproportionate, and it was a very collaborative environment because there were only like 8 or 10 people who were doing these kinds of investments.
Right.
And so what ended up happening was if one of us was in it, most of us were probably in it, which in a weird way is inefficient because it means if you don't break through that circle, the odds of you getting funded are lower. And so I think about a company like Pinterest, if you listen to any interviews with Ben, it was a very difficult company to raise.
Yeah.
Like they had a hard time raising. It wasn't well understood. It wasn't kind of a popular, fashionable company. So that's not that surprising to me that it sort of, I guess in a sense, fell through the cracks. And I think we'll probably never see that again because the venture environment has become so stratified and everybody's become so specialized in terms of the stage that they invest and what they're looking for. It's just harder to collaborate.
Yeah. Yeah, I did a big we picked out what we think are like the top 20 or 25 seed firms and did a big crosstabs of what deals they're all in together. And the highest correlation of anybody was like 30%. I think it was like Harrison Metal and Cowboy Ventures were highly correlated. But otherwise, like everyone's in a bunch of great things, and they're all different great things.
And the problem now is that, venture is a weird business, as you know. The more successful you are, the more access to capital you have from limited partners. Yeah. And one of my LPs once told me, AUM and fees scale faster than strategy.
Interesting.
And so there's this, I think, temptation where when you're grinding it out, it's so hard to get your first 1 or 2 funds done. Yeah. Suddenly you start to break through and people say, okay, we would give you 2x the capital. The question is, well, do you take it?
Yeah.
And if you take it, at some point, the collaborative $2 million seed deal that you would have split with your friend, each of you do $1 million, you need $1.5 million, and so does she.
Yeah.
And so it just doesn't work anymore. You can't collaborate in the same way.
Yeah, somebody explained this to me recently. So there, like venture capital, there's like the Harry Stebbings view of the world. Like, oh my God, this is like the best thing ever. I have like the Mad Max view of venture. Can be a hard, going to work at Sequoia Fund 8, not a hard business, but starting your own venture capital it's not working in a coal mine or anything like that, but it can be really tough. And somebody explained to me that when you start your own venture capital firm, you just grind so hard to raise money and you're happy to talk to anybody that will give you a check. And then when you come to that state where people are just giving you money, your physical reaction to that hasn't changed. So people are kind of critical of, oh, he's just taking money because he can. You're like, sometimes he or she is taking money because they've just ground for so long that it's in their psyche to say, I can get a check from somebody. Like, yes, like they're not above it, I guess.
Yeah, and I think also, to be fair, I know some really great investors whose aspiration was always to have a $100 million fund.
Yeah.
They're like, that's probably the comfortable sweet spot for me. They just couldn't start out there.
Yeah.
So they start out with 25 and do what makes sense at 25 and then get to 50 and get to 100 and then they're happy.
Yeah.
There are other people I know who maybe should have or would have been happier if they'd stayed where they were.
Yeah.
And now they've got more capital and they're doing the rational thing with that. But I do think that when you've struggled for that long and suddenly you have the ability to raise more money than you've raised before, I think it's really hard to say no to that.
Yeah, I think that's right. And then you have guys like, I guess, Tim Connors at Pivot North, who just won $30 million fund after another, though he could probably raise 10 times that. And it works out beautifully for him.
Benchmark.
Yeah.
They're pretty committed
Benchmark
to 400. Foundry Group historically has been pretty committed to Union Square. So I think the cool thing about this business is, on the one hand, you have these really dedicated, focused models of people who are like, hey, I know what we do. I know the dollar amount we can deploy with this strategy, and they stick to it and they do well. Yeah. And there's other people, I look at Initialized, Andreessen Horowitz, who've dramatically scaled their initial platforms and still continue to succeed.
Yeah. Oh, everything works. Like, you need to be focused and invest in a few companies. You need to invest in a lot of companies. You need to invest in minorities. You need to invest in like young white guys. Like, I've heard them all, and there are examples of all of them working.
As someone who has a much larger portfolio than the average VC, I can tell you most LPs don't think that works.
I guess. Well, we'll get to, so what animates you? You're at a very well respected venture capital firm in Silicon Valley. You have one of the, how many jobs are there on the planet in venture capital? Not many. You got one of them. And you're like, yeah, I'm out of here. What animated that decision?
It was a really hard decision because working with Jeff was awesome.
Jeff Clavier, who's the... Yeah.
And when we added Steph Palmieri to the team and we added Andy to the team, I thought we had a really good dynamic because we're all four really different people. I think part of venture, though, is everybody, I think, has a place in the market where you can be most effective. I have some friends who work at Institutional Venture Partners, IVP. They do later growth stage stuff. I barely understand what they're talking about when we get together.
Yeah, I can't.
I mean, they're very quantitative, very smart.
And they're investment bankers, practically.
Yeah, but I would give them more credit than that. Like, I think, wow. I think they have like a real sense for what does it take to build a public company, and like, am I looking at a company that has the potential to be public?
That's right.
And I don't have that skill set. I would probably not be terribly effective there. Yeah. And what I realized is that as Uncork got bigger and bigger and became more institutional, I remember when I first started working with Jeff, we did not have an admin. We had like a really small office. Yeah. It was just the two of us. And it really felt more like a boutique angel shop. Mm-hmm. And if I reflect on like when was I most satisfied with my day-to-day work, it was when we were working with companies that were pre-traction and pre-launch.
Right.
And we had a fund size that allowed us to do that work. And I tell people all the time, when you do 20 investments a year and those checks are a couple $100,000, you give yourself permission to be wrong sometimes. Mm-hmm. And you say, hey, I really feel good about this person. I think they're onto something. And you commit. And what I realized is as we became more institutional, the number of investments we made per year decreased and the financial and time commitment per company increased. Mm-hmm. And when I thought about, well, how do I feel about this? I said, I don't feel as comfortable investing this way. The other thing was, it wasn't just us. Cowboy got bigger, Freestyle got bigger, Floodgate, Felicis, ENIAC, all of the funds that we co-invested with were also getting bigger. So all of the entrepreneurs that we as a group would have funded before were all missing out on the opportunity to work with funds like that. And I was like, well, if I like the old work and all the people who I respect who did the old work are now doing new work, maybe I should go do it. But it's a super irrational thing to do. Yeah. To leave a venture fund that's on fund 4 and has good performance because you've crossed the chasm, like you're on the other side, and to go back in is kind of an irrational thing.
Well, and so in addition to leaving the venture fund, you kind of did it the hard way. You went out as a single GP, so you don't have a partner. You have a strategy of investing in a lot of companies that is fairly unusual. And I think you invest around the country, not just in Silicon Valley. So you added a couple layers of difficulty to your already difficult task, it seems like.
So I got some really good advice from someone that I did not take, but it was good advice nonetheless. When I was starting Precursor, the person says, so listen, let me get this straight. It's a generalist fund that's going to do 25 or 30 investments a year all around the country, one partner, low ownership. He's like, that's too many controversial assumptions in one fund.
Yeah.
And he said, you need to find a way to make this feel more conventional or you're going to have a really hard fundraise.
Yeah.
The person was right. It was a very difficult fundraise because the solo GP thing, it's borderline religious. People either think it works or it doesn't. I can point them to Kent Goldman and Manu Kumar and Michael Deering and Steve Anderson and all of these success cases. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
They have a point of view on it. All the other stuff, it's negotiable. But I will say that the way that we constructed the fund was really intentional, but it was hard for a lot of people to wrap their head around because it had a lot of things that in their mind don't work.
Yeah. And so so the thing that you do that's different is you invest in a lot of companies at a low valuations.
Yeah. So I would say if I think about people who invest the way we do, SV Angel, by their own admission, will do 40-ish companies a year. Mm-hmm. I think about Elizabeth and Eric at Hustle Fund. They're pretty active. And so we do 25 to 30 a year. And what I tell my limited partners is that 25 to 30 companies a year, I can actually spend some time with every company on a regular basis.
Right.
I'm not going to take a board seat. I'm not going to be there on Friday at 8 p.m. doing product whiteboarding, but I can spend enough time with them to get to know them and to try to be helpful. And as companies graduate, they honestly just ask me for less help.
Yeah. And how... This meme of like venture capital, there's like so many backstories. Oh my God, Pinterest was just nothing, and I came in as a venture capitalist, and I told them, add a zero to this thing, and now they're successful. How much do you think the VC has to do with the success of a company, other than giving people the capital?
Relatively little, honestly. And one of my LPs says, he's like, you have this weird anti-hero narrative for Precursor. I'm like, I don't think we're the hero of the story, and it's because we're not. My view is that we meet founders who literally need capital. Like they have almost everything else figured out. They need money. And it doesn't hurt my feelings to back a team where I'm like, actually, the money I'm giving you is the biggest unlock of all.
Yeah.
The other area where I find the founders we work with need a lot of help, they can tell the story of their company to their customers. They can't tell the story of their company to investors. And there's nothing wrong with the business. They just don't know how to arrange the facts in a way that make it most obvious and most compelling to other investors. And there's no reason they should.
Yeah.
Right? It's kind of, it's something you don't do that often. And so my view is most of the things that I think we can do to help companies are introduce them to other investors, try to help them see things about the business that they're not seeing, try to help them run an efficient and effective fundraising process, be available for last minute support when they're freaking out, and try to help them close candidates. Like I don't have any, I think, unique product insights that I can offer to someone who's spending 80 hours a week trying to crack the code. I can tell them when like, hey, you've been working on this for 4 months and it doesn't feel like to me as an outsider that it's working. And I think our value add is perspective, but I do think a big part of this job is selection. And sometimes you're selecting teams that you think would be successful without you. And sometimes you're selecting teams where you think you can bring one or two small additive things to the party that will make that team more successful.
That does seem like the one. Certainly when a VC is giving you product advice, you're doomed. I mean, I've been in companies where every VC shows up and it's like, this is the last conference. Like whatever the last conference you went to, that's what we need to go into. It's crazy. And I don't know why VCs, like what it is about them. If you said to somebody, your LP, hey, I invested in Uber, but I didn't do anything. I just invested and then they didn't want my advice. Your LP wouldn't be like, oh no, that's terrible. They'd be like, great, you invested in Uber. So I don't know why people feel that need to be like, and I helped Uber.
Oh, I get it. I think for me, it's not, my ego is fine if I'm like, you know what? The most important thing I did for this company was I said yes quickly and gave them money. And that was that's what differentiated me. That's not an inspiring narrative, Kent. Like it's not, but I think sometimes it's the truth. And I think in a world where you have hundreds of venture capital funds. I think the biggest change I've seen in this business in the last 15 years is venture funds spend a lot more time, and Precursor does this too, marketing what we can do for you beyond money.
Yeah.
And in a world where there's a lot of places where you could theoretically get money, having something else, and I think like my view is the thing I can do for the founders in our portfolio is like we have 300 founders in our portfolio. If you don't have a network of founders, you are going to get one by virtue of being part of our portfolio. And that's actually probably as valuable or more valuable than anything that I, as Charles, can do for you specifically, because now you're going to have a crew and a support system and people who are going through the same journey as you are. And that's unique. And I think in a world, like I said, where there's this much capital, I think investors feel the need to stand out both to limited partners and entrepreneurs.
Yeah, I guess that's right. And I think the piece of advice I see, excuse me, giving to like a founder that the founders may find helpful, or the thing that I've done wrong in companies is where you're into it and you just go too long. And I don't know what it is. And the minute I've been in companies where I'm like, this is amazing, this product is great, these people love it. And the minute I step out of it, the company fails or I just leave, and you look back and you're like, oh yeah, it was just this tiny thing I was just this little blip off in the corner of the world, and the world didn't need me. In the moment, and if I could go back and tell myself, be like, you've done this for 3 months, the things you thought were going to happen didn't happen. You're now making up new things that you think are going to happen, but that was never your vision. That's kind of I don't know how you can communicate that to somebody though, but that's a mistake I've made over and over. And
I try really hard to have that conversation with people, and sometimes we have it in an elegant way, and every now and then I fumble it, but I get the message across. And I tell them one of the advantages of having such a large portfolio is I can tell people like, hey, we've had 9 companies raise Series A this quarter that were software as a service. Let me tell you what they look like.
Yeah.
And we can compare what you look like to the 9 that closed their rounds. And sometimes people go, wow. And look, I think part of it is I don't think I can actually tell people things. I think I can help them discover things.
Yeah.
And, one of our real philosophies at the firm is that learning is better than telling. Yeah. And so there's certain times when we have founders in our portfolio that I see them struggling with an issue. And my LP's like, why don't you jump in and help them? I'm like, well, you know what? It's going to cost them 2 weeks if they struggle and wrestle with this issue and solve it on their own.
Yeah.
And then they will have built a new muscle. If I jump in here and solve it, I'm going to sort of shortcut the learning.
Yeah.
And so there's just a lot of cases where I'm like, I really need, sometimes I'll tell people like, wow, my perception is this isn't working. And they'll say, well, it feels like it's working okay. I'm like, okay, well, here's where we were 3 months ago and here's where we are today. If we continue at this growth rate for 3 more quarters, here's what we'll be in a year. Does that feel like success to you? And sometimes they'll go, oh no, when you put it that way, suddenly I'm not satisfied with, or you say, hey, we have 9 months of cash. Assume it takes 3 months to raise. In 6 months, where do you think the company's going to be? And we'll have that conversation. I'm like, do you think we could fundraise with that set of facts? And they'll go, oh gosh, no. And sometimes it's just helping people see the big picture, which is the most valuable thing you can do as an investor.
And do you ever get frustrated by people just not listening to you, not hearing it, not like when you say, oh, you should do this with your product, and they go, you don't understand. I think that's fair. But when you say, man, I've done this a million times and I know that that's not a good result, is it just a frustration where they go, no, you don't understand it. We need 5 more features. And you're like, oh, you don't need 5 more features, dude. That's not it.
I think probably one of the areas where I've grown the most as an investor is when I was earlier in my career, I used to get very frustrated when things seem obvious to me and I could not communicate them to the founders. Now I'm like, if the message isn't landing, it's my fault. It's not their fault.
Yeah.
So rather than get frustrated that they're not listening, the question is, okay, well, how could I package this message in a way that it will get through?
Yeah.
Because the goal is to ideally have them see the thing that I see, not to have them receive it in the way that's easiest for me to communicate it. So sometimes I have founders, and I love stubborn founders in our portfolio. I'll tell them something 2 or 3 times. I'm like, okay, that angle for that message did not work. Why not? Oh, this person's very resistant to hearing this piece of information. How can I reframe this conversation in a way that's going to get them to see what I want them to see? And oftentimes what I've realized is if the thing you're telling them is existential and direct, it's very hard. If you're sort of like, hey, the product doesn't work.
Yeah.
that's a really hard thing to hear. Is like, what do you do with that as a founder, right?
Yeah.
You're like, well, your instinct is like, well, let me double down and like build some more stuff. And if you don't give people a way to hear that, digest it, and not feel defensive, you're going to get resistance.
Right.
And so I spent a lot of time thinking about how do I deliver this? And look, I don't get it right every time.
Yeah.
This is a fact.
Do you think you get do you think you lose anything as you get, quote, better at being a venture capitalist? Are you getting worse at anything? Are you getting too clever at picking out people, or too jaded, too used to saying no, that you're like, man, early on I would have invested in this guy and it would have been a bad decision, but it turned out to be, I wouldn't have invested in Uber because it was, the CEO wasn't there and all that. Like, can you get too good at being a venture capitalist?
I think you can become too convinced that the weight of the past evidence that you have at your disposal is more valuable than it actually is.
Yeah.
So I think it's sort of like you say, I've seen this a million times before. Actually, you've seen this exactly once. You've seen this founder in this market context at this time with this problem exactly once. You've seen other things that are similar. And so I think part of the challenge is like, how do you both leverage your past experience, but still have the humility and wherewithal to realize that even if the situation you're seeing looks and feels a lot like another one, it's still in fact different.
Yeah.
And I think founders pick up on that, the difference between, at least the ones I work with, the difference between you saying, hey, every time I've seen a company do this, X thing happens. That doesn't help you as an individual, because now I've just put you in a bucket of a bunch of other companies and you think yours is unique.
Right.
Versus saying like, hey, I've seen this a bunch of times before. Let me tell you some of the ways I've seen this play out.
Right.
And here's what I've learned from that. And I think you can easily just become really convinced that you've seen it all before, and that in every situation, you know what to do.
Do you see any trends with founders? Somebody recently said something to me like, oh, the problem now is you get these Facebooks and Googles and Ubers, and they just hoover everybody up, engineers who might be starting companies, and there's such a clear path to becoming wealthy by just staying there for 10 years that they don't go start a company. Or, I'm just making this part up and adding it, but when they do start a company, they're already so wealthy that the kind of animating force of like, somebody who's broke and trying to make something work isn't there either.
I guess I've seen a different thing, which is I think when you've been at a really successful company, whether you were there at the very beginning or after it was already working, I think it's really hard for an individual to know how important was I in the overall success of this company? How much of this success was already working before I showed up?
Yeah.
And then I think sometimes the things that worked at your last company, they're not generalizable principles.
Right.
They were specific. And I see this a lot of times with people who leave Google now. You have an abundance of resources at that company that you will not have at a startup. And some people, I think, can recognize and appreciate that. And others, I think, it ends up being a real shock to the system when they get outside and are like, oh, yeah, all the stuff I took for granted and didn't even realize I needed to do, I suddenly need to do. And that can be very disconcerting for people.
Yeah, this has driven me crazy. I was at a very successful startup, and the venture capitalist was bringing people in, and they couldn't bring in an executive who didn't have at the time it was Intuit or Yahoo or something on the resume. And these companies were just rocket ships, and you showed up at work and like money just fell out of the ceiling. And they were not terrible executives, but not good at a very difficult startup. The guy you should have hired, the woman you should have hired, is somebody who struggled really hard and really intelligently against a really hard problem. It didn't quite get there, but at the company you never heard of. And they would never do that. It was a disaster.
Most of the top performing founders in our portfolio actually come from companies that at one point in time looked like they were really working and then hit a rough spot, and the people went through that. And it's been really interesting. And some of the most challenging investments we've had have been with people who have these gold-plated resumes from these awesome companies, and it just didn't work out, didn't translate.
Let me ask you a question about inclusion in Silicon Valley. I just had Ellen Powell on the podcast. I've tried to have, this is tough, I've tried to have half people of color and half the combined group and women be half the people on the podcast. It's tougher than you would think, though, because Silicon Valley is so many white men. And people say, hey, do you want to talk to Scott Cooper? And do you want to talk to Ryan Hoover? And you go, yeah. And all of a sudden, your website looks like a and it looks like the U.S. Senate at some point. But what do you make of the? In talking to Ellen Pao, I started realizing something where people talk about women, people of color, et cetera, in Silicon Valley, and those are such different things, and they kind of get grouped together. And I kind of went through this continuum as I was thinking about this. Is like you've kind of got like the gay white man in Silicon Valley. I don't know what his experience is, but there's examples of it. Tim Cook. There's examples of it working. You think of like a woman. Okay, there's examples of that working. When you get Sheryl Sandberg, et cetera, and you get to people of color, that drops off a lot. Like these aren't all the same thing. Like what do I make of this?
I think it's mostly about access to social capital and not the firm.
Right.
I think it's really, and here's what I would say. And I think I appreciate this as someone who's gone to Stanford and gets access to stuff that maybe the average black person in Silicon Valley doesn't get. Almost every white male venture capitalist I know knows a white woman. Probably quite a few.
Yeah.
Might even be married to one.
Yeah.
Probably also has regular social contact outside of work with Asian Americans. Indian, Chinese, Japanese, Korean. Because in our society, like if you're a white male venture capitalist who lives in Pacific Heights or Atherton, I can tell you who your neighbors are.
Yeah.
They do not look like me.
Yeah.
I can tell you who the other parents are in your kid's preschool or elementary school that's probably private. Also unlikely to look like me. And when you think about like, well, where do these investments come from? Like where do people find the companies to invest in? If it was a world where like, hey, we just have a form on our website, everybody, whether you're my best friend or a random, has to fill out this form, and we pick the best ideas to meet with based on what you write in this form, venture capital will look different. No firm that I know runs that way. Right. What ends up happening is like, oh, Kent and I work together in Founders Den, and he's doing this company, and because I know him, like we're just going to meet with him, and I have total comfort because I know you in this context outside of you pitching me. Or it's like, okay, well, maybe I don't know you, but you're also a Stanford alum. So I have some affinity for you because we went to the same school. And I just think in general, Latinx and black people are not part of those social circles. They're not part of where you live. And I have a lot of, non-black venture capitalist friends who do not have meaningful social interactions with a Latinx or black person. I think especially for black women. Like I can think of relatively few people I know who've had a black woman as a boss or manager.
Interesting.
And probably all of them worked for Stacey Brown-Philpott, the ones that I do know. Like it's pretty crazy. And so I think when you have a world where you don't spend time with black or brown people socially, you've never worked with them in a professional context, you've never been at a company where they were in visible senior leadership positions, they're just not part of your world.
Yeah.
And they end up feeling really foreign. And I think it's funny, this whole like, I want my portfolio companies to be close enough that I can ride a bike to go see them.
Right.
Well, if your office is on Sand Hill Road,
right.
you're really limiting the universe.
It's hard to get to Chicago from Sand Hill Road.
And I think it's funny that like, the thing that makes me optimistic is 10 years ago, the received wisdom was like, oh, that's a good thing that you only invest in companies that are really close to you with people that you know. And I think now people are like, well, that's a really limiting view of where opportunity lies. But I don't think we've cracked the code on the social piece yet.
Yeah.
And I think venture capital is a risky business. And I think most VCs are looking for ways to reduce riskiness, and comfort is one way to reduce riskiness.
So what of investing in minorities, women, people of color, et cetera? How do you I had Monique Woodard on the podcast, and she's a black woman who's raising a venture capital fund. And she said, and I've heard this from other people raising funds, she said people would sometimes like want to give her money, like a foundation. And she's like, no, I'm going to invest in these people, but because I think they're going to make me more money. I'm not doing this I want to help them, but it's not a charity. It's a money-making operation. How do you think about that with like a black founder?
It's hard. One thing I think about is And so we have a portfolio that's about almost a quarter of the founders in our portfolio are black and brown. And the way I think about it is, I think black and brown founders need white founders in their network. And I think white founders need to be exposed to black and brown founders. I think male founders need female founders in their network and vice versa, because you need bridges.
Yeah.
And I think we have founders in our portfolio where I've seen white male founders get fundraising advice from female founders of color in our portfolio. And I'm like, I think this only happens because you have a common context, which is you're all part of Precursor.
Yeah.
I don't know that this would happen otherwise. And so I do think that a couple of things. The number of times I've walked into a room and seen an LP that looks like me, shockingly small.
Interesting.
Really small.
Yeah.
Second, what I would say is, even though Precursor thinks differently about the value of having a diverse portfolio, I know that the market writ large is not with us. Yeah. And so the challenging thing is, I'm like, even if we think differently, I know that these companies are going to potentially have more challenging fundraisers. Until once you get to Series A and B, it's a little bit different because you've got some data.
Yeah.
But prior to that, I'm like, wow, there's a chance that these companies are going to have more difficult fundraisers, not because of explicit racism, but because of bias and discrimination. Yeah. And it's hard to, on the one hand, say that I know that that's going to happen and I don't want the founder to think about it, but also on the other hand, know like, hey, we have to plan for the fact that fundraising for this company could be more challenging given the racial and ethnic background of the founding team.
I heard something. I had Vincent Robinson on the podcast. I don't know if you know him. He went to Stanford, black guy, worked at Goldman Sachs. And he was telling me the story that he went to a wedding. And this is like, black people at the wedding. And he said it was all his friends from Stanford, and they were all incredibly successful. They were all working at Goldman Sachs and McKinsey and Bain, but none of them had started companies. And he was like, "What? Why?" And his answer was like, well, a lot of them just came from these backgrounds that were kind of tough for whatever reason, economically, they didn't roll out of Hillsborough and their dad get them into Stanford. And he said what he thought had happened is that as these people had gotten jobs at Goldman Sachs that paid them $600,000 a year, their ethos was like, you take the job at Goldman Sachs for $600,000 a year. You don't screw around for 2 years getting not paid. And that Mark Zuckerberg actually came from a place that allowed him, for example, to think nothing of saying no to Goldman Sachs and just, I'll take 2 years off. So that there was this sort of structural thing that you really can't blame anybody for, but you could see it.
And I think from what I've seen too, like that's just not unique to people of color. That's often the case for first generation college students, period.
That's fair. Yeah.
That, you have this really valuable, it's funny, it's just not even an undergrad, it's at the business school level too. You are a person who, quote unquote, like should be happy to be here. Yeah. Like you are one of a very small number of people who look like you, who've made it. And so how do you then take that golden ticket and flush it down the toilet and do a startup?
Yeah.
And, depending on your family situation, you might not get much familial support financially or emotionally about your decision to do something risky when there's a really safe option on the table.
Yeah.
And I do think that having a financial and emotional safety net that says like you can try things and if they don't work, it's okay, is really, really helpful.
Yeah. And what's a white guy? One of the memes I have on this podcast is that I come into these conversations not understanding things, and then the gimmick is you learn about them as I come to understand them. So having women on, if you're a white guy who's not harassing anybody, you're not getting harassed, it's not that you think it doesn't go on in Silicon Valley. It's that it's just not in your mind. It's not in your world. And that has animated women to come on and go, oh, let me tell you. Like, does it go on? Like, let me tell you about yesterday. That kind of a thing. And as a white guy, you're like, it's like, what do I do? What do you do as like a white guy venture capitalist, which I guess is what I am now, to include more people of color? Like, what is the right thing to do? Should you even be part of the conversation, or is it none of your damn business? Or like, what do you do?
I appreciate you asking, because I think a lot of people are afraid to ask because they're like, is it even okay for me to ask this question?
Yeah, well, that's
or does this like, is this like I've already committed a violation by asking the question?
That was my tone, yeah.
So here's what I think. I think we're at a point in time where, and I've asked a handful of my female founder friends, I was like, so what do you? They go, oh, I go to the firm's website and I look at all the pictures of the people and I scroll down. And if I don't see any women, I'm kind of like, well, the actions speak louder than whatever messaging they might put out there. So I think we're moving to a world where, like, at some point, you're going to have actions that match the words. I think for female founders, we're rapidly approaching that moment. I think for founders of color, it's a more distributed constituency. And truth be told, I think today, if you were a venture capitalist and said, we don't invest in female founders because we think there aren't many of them and they're not very good, you would get shouted off of Twitter.
Yeah.
And people would say, here's 100 examples. I think if you said that about people of color, people would say, well, there haven't been that many companies that they've started. And then that's a whole chicken and egg. Well, how does it happen without capital? And that's a whole nother conversation. I think one of the things I encourage people to do is, if your whole process is oriented towards warm intros, you're based on everything I told you before, you're not going to see people of color. You're not going to see them. So I think the things I tell people is, if you want to meet more founders of color, go to where they are. Go to where they are, go to the events and connect with people who can connect you with them. And two, one of the things we do at Precursor that I try really hard is, I want us to be an open firm. I want us to be a firm where a founder says, I have a good idea. I don't know Charles or Sydney or Ayana, but I know how to get in touch with them. And if I reach out to them and with a clean, clear ask and a decent presentation, I have a shot at getting money from them. Doesn't mean you will. And we've gotten pretty close on a few things that have come in through the cold channel. But I think it's as much about attitude and presentation of your firm as it is what you say. Because I think it's a lot easier to just go to a website and look at who they've actually given money to. And you're like, okay, do I think I'm really going to be the first person who looks like me who gets money from these people? Maybe. Versus a fund where, you look on the website, well, there's some evidence that they take this stuff seriously. And so I think venture I think a lot of this is generational too. Mm. A lot of the millennial GPs and principal people that I meet, they're naturally more open to meeting people from different backgrounds. And I think there's a better appreciation that by saying we only want to meet Harvard and Stanford computer scientists who went to Stanford, MIT, or other grade school, you're really limiting the pool.
Right.
And so I just think it's really important to think about, is your firm, it's funny, one of the most common pieces of feedback I get from entrepreneurs is I went to your website and I really liked it because the first thing I saw was a bunch of faces. Mm-hmm. Not a bunch of company logos, but a bunch of faces of the people that you've backed. And they're like, that made an impression upon me about what you value.
Oh, that's really interesting. That meme has changed over time, of the kind of cold email. It used to be well, if you're not smart enough to get to me, how can you run a company? And now I've heard really thoughtful venture capitalists say, no, you can be cold email, but make it thoughtful. So if you have looked at my portfolio and said, based on the things you invest in, I think what I'm doing is really relevant to you, and it's thoughtful, and I see you did this and that, and I loved your talk that I watched on YouTube, then it's cold, but it's thoughtful is the key.
Yeah, and I would say also we have 300 portfolio company founders, many of whom are pretty open. So look, here's the difference. I would say if you are here in San Francisco and you're reasonably connected, you worked at Google or Facebook, you worked at a company where you ought to know people who know venture capitalists, and you come in cold, that feels weird.
Yeah.
If you're in Tennessee, I actually don't expect you to know anybody in my network, nor should you necessarily. Yeah. And so I guess I apply a slightly different filter to people. But truth be told, we have some founders here who are mid-level startup people, director level at good companies. They don't know any VCs.
Yeah.
They just don't. And why should I penalize them for that?
It's funny that is true with the fancy venture capitalists I worked with. They don't know anybody who's really useful to an entrepreneur. To be honest, they know Queen Noor and Al Gore and all these amazing people, but Queen Noor is not going to start a company with me or be my head of marketing. Mm-hmm. So that is interesting. Well, I have one final question for you. Andy McLaughlin, who you worked with, I pinged him before this, and he said to ask you if you missed working with Jeff Clavier.
I honestly do. I really do. I could say a lot about what I miss about working with Jeff. I think the one thing I realized, people always ask me, would you hire a partner at Precursor? I'm like, I don't know. We don't have very much in management fees. I kind of like the way it works now. But the thing I miss about working with Jeff is like his view on startups was just different than mine. Like much more, I would say, of a touchy-feely kind of person. And I think there would be conversations we'd have where he would just bring a level of clarity that I was missing around. I was like so busy falling in love with the founder that I was missing some really obvious thing about the business. I think the other thing I did not appreciate until I started my own firm is Jeff made the operational management of soft tech Uncork look effortless, and it is far from effortless to actually do all of the behind the scenes thing on LP management, capital calls, budgeting, strategy. All of that stuff takes an enormous amount of time, and he never made me feel bad about not doing as much of that as he did as the managing partner. I saw I really feel like I only saw the tip of the iceberg when I worked there because he did so much of it and made it look easy. And he's been a really important resource and mentor for me since I started Precursor because I'm like, oh man, he's like, yeah, it's a lot, isn't it? I'm like, it is a lot. So sometimes I get stuck on things where I'm trying to make strategic decisions about what we do at Precursor, and Jeff is one of the first people I call, and he's been super gracious and very supportive.
That's great. That's lovely. So how do people get in touch with you if they want to follow what you're thinking or bring their company to you?
You can email me at charles@precursorvc.com. That's easy. Some people send me Twitter DMs. I actually get quite a few of those. That works fine. I don't really like being pitched on LinkedIn. That doesn't work as well for me. So email's fine, or Twitter. It's cool.
All right. Thanks so much for doing this.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
All right. This has been the Something Venture Podcast. I'm Kent Lindstrom. Talk to you next time.